Welcome to episode 45 of Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro. My name is Rayleen Hargreaves. I'm a principal consultant and Reconcilor product owner at Snowden Optiro. Today, I am joined by Ian Glacken, who is an executive consultant with Snowden Optiro. Ian is a geologist with postgraduate qualifications in geostatistics, mining geology, and computing, who has more than 35 years worldwide experience in the mining industry. And fortunately for us, he is also a passionate advocate for continuous improvement via reconciliation across the entire mining value chain. The topic of this podcast is reconciliation versus rescaling. Welcome, Ian, and thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Rayleen. It's great to be working on the same team again.
It is.
Being side by side for all these years.
Excellent. So let's just get started, Ian. Do you have a fail-safe definition of reconciliation that our listeners will remember?
Sure. If you look at the dictionary definition, it's not really appropriate, but my definition is, and I think it's a pretty universal definition in the mining industry, what we're trying to do is compare prediction, or in reality, multiple predictions with in general, a single reality. So we're comparing the predictions and the reality, and we're making a number of conclusions or assumptions or changes on the basis of that relationship between the prediction and the reality. So I think that's a pretty reasonable definition of what people are trying to do.
Look, Ian, I agree with everything you've just said. And for me, I always think of the definition as your estimate versus your actual. So exactly along the same lines as your definition, that prediction versus your actual. When we do talk about reconciliation versus rescaling, what do you think is the difference between the two?
Well, we just given a definition of reconciliation, which is comparing one number or one set of numbers with a truth, if you like, as much as we can trust that truth. Rescaling is when that truth is actually used to amend or adjust the predictions. So in other words, if we have an actual tons and grade and metal, we do all the adjustments for stockpiles and whatever. And then once we're happy with that, we actually factor the claimed or the prediction, if you like, or the predictions to match the truth, if you like, or the end of the process. So that's what we would call rescaling. So we're actually taking the factors from the reconciliation exercise all the way back to the predictions and physically changing the predictions.
Okay, and I think it is important to note that there is confusion. Like when I talk to people about reconciliation, unless we've done those definitions and what they consider reconciliation, they can often be talking about rescaling, because in their world, that is their reconciliation. So I think before any conversation that I have, I always ask, how do you define reconciliation? Just to make sure that we're on the same page, because we don't want to be talking about that, somebody talking about rescaling the whole time we're talking about reconciliation. So because they are quite different.
So why, Rayleen, why do you think that there's a motivation for mines to do rescaling rather than reconciliation? What do you think what's driving them in that direction?
I think it's the low confidence that they're having in the grade being delivered to the plant, which is usually triggered by that poor mine to mill reconciliation, that metal reconciliation. Now that can be a combination of stockpile management, maybe it's the material movement tracking, so actually tracking that source ID to stockpile, and then maybe it's to another stockpile. It could be the uncertainty of the grade in the model. So maybe there's not enough sampling in that interpretation. Loads of different reasons, but they're the three big ones that I see: the stockpile management, material movement tracking, and the uncertainty of the grade in the model. I think what's important to note though is, we can accommodate the whole rescaling and doing those factors against those raw movements, but I don't think at any stage you should be overriding the raw numbers. The raw numbers are your best estimate at the time, and if you have low confidence in those, then you should be going and trying to improve the way that you're getting that measure rather than just overriding it. There is value in doing that back calculation, that rescaling, just to see how out your measurements were, those raw measurements were. And for this to happen in a product like Reconcilor, we do carry two sets of numbers. So we'll have our raw number, which is your original estimates, and we can also bring in an adjusted value. So that rescaling number to be able to compare. And again, it's just so that you can see the trends in the data, how far out those raw numbers could be, and why those raw numbers can't be trusted. You know, that's ultimately your reconciliation, is that original number versus your measure, your actual, sorry. So we need to be able to trust those first estimates.
Yes, no, I absolutely agree with your sentiments. I mean, I think if you are going to do it, that's fine, but I think we need to quite clearly keep the two sets of numbers away from each other and make it quite clear when we're doing the rescaling and when we're doing a reconciliation. So yes, I fully agree.
Mm-hmm. Do you consider there's pros and cons of rescaling data?
Yes, I thought about this, and it's to my mind, it's pretty hard to think of any pros, but I guess one of the pros is that your system balances. It's and thinking about it, you know, you have the plant doing a metallurgical balance, and that's where they balance the metal and the tails coming out one end of the plant with the tungsten grey coming in the other. And I guess one of the reasons that rescaling has gained some popularity, perhaps on the mine side of things, is the desire to do a similar thing. In other words, we've got this recalculated metal, the metal plus the tails that's coming, and then we're making the mine prediction equal to that. So I can see that's probably a pro of it. The cons are that you're chasing a moving target, as you alluded to just then. And one of the things I remember from some of the work I did in the early noughties in South Africa, when they had all of these large Witwatersrand conglomerate, the classic, the very deep mines, and it was very common there across a lot of companies to take the mine core factor, in other words, the factor that we derive from the reconciliation, and then apply that back to the following year's reserve. So let's suppose that the mine was producing 98% of the gold that the reserve was claiming. So then what they would do is they would reduce the reserve for the next year by 2%. And I remember thinking at the time that was horrific, because you know they're forever chasing a moving target, and in certain cases that factor got bigger and bigger and bigger after 1 year, from 1 year to the next, and so there was never any consistency or stability. So to my mind, it's much better to have that prediction. In reality, as I say, it's 3 or 4 predicted numbers, including the as mined. Have the recalculator or the truth, if we want to call that, the actuals, and then work out why they're different. And you've mentioned some of the reasons, and there's many reasons why they might be different, and then work to making them consistent or similar. So to me, that's a big negative. In fact, this issue of chasing a moving target, which I think is never the right thing to do.
So Ian, given your wealth of experience across many commodity groups, across many countries, is there a commodity group that you would consider as leading the charge in best practice reconciliation, or do you see it being driven from a corporate level?
Yes, I think it's very much driven from a corporate level, and it's generally driven by a desire from the management team, the executive management team, to have access to the data. So, for instance, you know, companies that have multiple operations, multiple commodities, multiple countries, the management team, the executive management team, depending on their skill set and their desire, they want to keep control of things, and so they generally instigate the reconciliation process. Having said that, I think some commodities it's more prevalent than others. And I think the reason for that is that a lot of the measurements are already being taken. So for instance, iron ore is a bulk commodity. There's generally lots of very high quality measurements, generally of tons. And then therefore those measurements at the mine side and obviously on the plant side are already being taken, and that sort of lends itself to the development of a reliable reconciliation system. But I think the defining characteristic is the desire for management, maybe at the operational level or at the corporate level, to have something that they can use to compare their multiple operations, or something that makes sense. And that's probably the overriding factor in determining who does it properly and who doesn't do it very well at all.
And sort of moving on to the types of mines, do you think there's any value in rescaling data when different sources like sub-level caves, block caves, stopes, open pits are involved in feeding material to the same plant within the same month?
Oh, well, you've identified there some of the issues that are really hard from a reconciliation point of view. That's sub-level caving and block caving, and anyone that's ever worked in those mines know that it's not entirely a lottery, and that would be unfair because the mines have the draw modeling system, but it's largely the case. And I do remember some work we did 2 or 3 years ago, and without naming any names, it was a block cave that was like the magic pudding. It kept on giving, and they were drawing it 160, 170% of the tons, and it was keep coming. So I think given that, I think this idea of rescaling, particularly for those bulk production sources, it's not a good idea. So I think if you had let's suppose you had a very tight set of sub-level caves, or if you had an open pit, there might be an argument for rescaling if it was a fairly constrained or tight system. But I think if you have multiple sources, I think you want to know as much as possible what the performance of those multiple sources are. And once you tar them all with the same brush, let's call it that, by rescaling is what we're doing, you lose that ability. And clearly, you'd imagine that a block cave or a sub-level cave, you would be reconciling a lot more poorly than, say, a long hole open stope or a bench in an open pit. So I think it's useful to know that. So from that point of view, I think rescaling when you've got multiple different sources isn't going to work.
I think I agree with that blanket overall rescaling, that factor. What we have seen is some confidence levels being placed on different sources. So, if you've got a block cave and you think that's actually got a higher confidence in the grade compared to, say, your sub-level cave, we can do weighting based on that. But again, it's still just a rescaling of some raw numbers. It's not reconciliation. It is trying just to get the numbers to balance and trying to get closer to that metal that's being produced at the end. So I think, it's whilst I think everybody has best intentions when they're doing their rescaling to be trying to work out what's actually going on in the mine. Why are we not making the grade? It's usually that way. Like I said, I think it's in best intentions. It's just making sure that we're doing best practice as well at the same time.
Yes, I agree. I think it's a desire to impose accounting principles, and if you ever speak to an accountant and you say, well, my reconciliations within 10%, they're horrified, because they would like the numbers to be within 1% or 0.5% or less than that. So I think there's a desire to impose those strictures of the accounting profession on the mine, and geologists, we realise that it's an uncertain business, and so I think just making it match isn't as useful as understanding why it doesn't match.
For sure. Look, when I see a 1 to 2% variance in numbers, I'm horrified. I'm like, where are you doing your rescaling? Where are you doing your factors? All about transparency. I need to know how we can actually fix a problem if you've got a problem, rather than just hiding it. Look, Ian, that does draw this podcast to a close. I would like to thank you for joining us on Fresh Thinking and for joining me in this reconciliation discussion. Obviously, we can probably talk for hours on this. We do need to keep it short, but so thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Rayleen. It's been a pleasure.
If you'd like to listen to more of our Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro podcasts, you will find them for free on our website, Spotify, YouTube, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and most other podcast platforms.